Beneath the streets of central London, a subway ran for over 76 years, yet it never carried a single passenger. In fact, it didn't appear on maps, and the public had no idea that it existed. This was London's Underground Mail Train, a hidden system carrying letters and parcels beneath the city's busiest streets day and night. Built exclusively for mail, the rail stretched for miles from west to east, linking central sorting offices with London's mainline stations. The technology was remarkable for the era, as the trains were unmanned, fully electronic, and remote controlled. In other words, this was an automated network operating beneath the chaos of the streets above. At its peak, millions of letters passed through these tunnels every day. And then, almost without notice, everything fell apart. The tunnels were sealed, and the system was left behind as the city above moved ahead. So, how did London come to build an entire underground railway just for mail? And why was it ultimately abandoned? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the story of London's lost underground mail rail. I'm your host, Ryan Sokesh, and you're watching It's History. Now, before there was ever an underground railway for mail, London already sat at the center of a global communication system, and this brought its leaders a serious set of challenges. By the mid-19th century, the British Postal Service had become one of the largest and most complex networks of its type. And it's easy to forget that back then, the country's imperial force still connected Britain to lands stretching across Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. And of course, London was the hub of it all, but the city itself was becoming an obstacle. So, as London expanded through the 19th century, its streets grew increasingly congested. Every short journey across the city could take hours, and so surface mail deliveries became increasingly unreliable. In that state of affairs, it didn't take long before the post office began to experiment. For example, in the 1850s, the city installed a pneumatic tube system, which we already covered on this channel, but just to recap, this was basically an underground system of pipes that used air pressure to propel canisters between offices. These systems worked, but only on a small scale since they had many problems. For starters, they were only suitable for documents and telegrams, not bulk mail. Furthermore, capacity was limited and maintenance was a whole other story, since when those tubes would jam, workers would routinely need to tear up entire sections of streets or even building foundations to resolve the problem. In other words, the pneumatic delivery system was impressive, but it ultimately proved to be insufficient. Now, in the midst of all this, a separate transformation was also taking place beneath the city. In 1863, the world's first underground passenger railway opened, demonstrating that tunneling under a dense city was feasible. Over the following decades, the London Underground expanded further, steadily normalizing deep-level tunneling, electric traction, and centralized signaling. Meaning, as the technical barriers of underground transportation dissipated, the post office took note. And this made sense because mail was already being moved by rail, and at scale, not just in Britain, but across the world. Above ground, dedicated postal carriages were a standard practice. As one surviving example could be seen here, where a preserved European mail wagon shows how the systems worked. Bulk mail was carried in specialized cars, sorted en route, and transferred at major stations. From there, it was handed off to surface transportation for final delivery. This was effective by 19th century standards, but in dense cities like London, the weakest links remained the streets themselves, where congestion, weather, and distance erased the advantages rail had already provided. With that in mind, by the early 20th century, London's central sorting offices, particularly the one in Mount Pleasant, had become some of the busiest postal facilities on Earth. And so it was. In 1911, official plans proposed a dedicated underground railway linking London's main railway terminal with its central sorting offices. Though there was a distinction. You see, unlike the passenger underground, this new system would carry mail only. Trains would be miniature, automated, and operate continuously. Parliament approved the plan, and construction was slated to begin in 1915. The tunnels were driven deep beneath central London using the same circular cast iron lining techniques pioneered by the underground, but on a smaller scale. Initially, crews excavated boreholes by hand, assembling prefabricated iron rings as they advanced. creating a continuous underground corridor designed purely for freight. And then, just when things were moving along nicely, global events intervened. The First World War drained labor, materials, and funding for the project. And although much of the tunneling was completed, the railway sat unfinished by the end of the war. Tracks lay unused, power systems were incomplete, and the rolling stock had yet to be fully built or even tested. So for years, this project just sat in limbo. Even in the decade after the war, Britain faced more shortages of things like steel, electric components, and skilled labor. So understandably, national priorities shifted and the project remained stalled. However, after some time passed, industrial production stabilized and, importantly, automated control technology matured. So they gave it another go. With the tunnels already in place, the post office fully recommitted to the idea. And after a few more years of construction, the railway finally opened, nearly a decade after excavation had initially begun. When the system finally opened on December the 3rd, 1927, it did so just in time for Christmas post. Officially titled the Post Office Tube Railway, the line stretched roughly 5.6 miles, and along the way, it served 8 major stations, most of which were located directly beneath major sorting offices, including Mount Pleasant, King Edward Street, and Liverpool Street. The trains themselves were unlike anything the passenger underground had seen. These vehicles were narrow, low-profile electric machines built to carry mailbags, not people. In fact, they didn't have windows or seating, since everything was controlled remotely from a central operating room. The trains followed fixed routes through the tunnels, guided by an automated signaling system that regulated speed, spacing, and junctions. In the later decades, this electromechanical system was upgraded and computerized. Still, the basic principle remained the same: a centrally controlled, automated railway that moved mail through London without human operators inside the actual trains. At its peak, the system carried up to 4 million letters per day, departing every few minutes during peak periods and stopping for less than a minute at each platform. When those trains arrived, workers loaded and unloaded mail at conveyor-fed platforms designed purely for speed. And as you might imagine, the impact was immediate. Journeys that once took hours by road were reduced to minutes. The railway operated independently of weather, traffic, or surface strikes. In fact, during the Second World War, it proved to be vital. Even after a bombing strike flooded parts of the system in 1943, operations resumed the very next day. For decades, the Post Office Railway was one of the most efficient logistics systems in the city. Largely invisible, but indispensable. It was just one of those little things that made a significant difference in daily life, which is a notion that we could all appreciate, even beyond mail. Since, let's face it, parcel transport is essential, no matter how you frame it, and especially in our modern world. For example, when I'm out recording on the road or in hotel rooms as I'm doing right now, I have to carry so much gear with me that I usually end up lugging around big, bulky bags. But thanks to today's sponsor, Bellroy, that has all changed. Bellroy makes it easy to bring all of the stuff I need with their highly efficient, lightweight designs. For example, I've been using their Ready Pack, which holds all the equipment that I need without adding excessive weight. It's so light, actually, you can even fold this down and put it right into another bag. Now, another one of my favorite products of theirs is this laptop caddy, which can hold much more than just my laptop. It's basically like my portable office. In fact, I use it to transport things like, my microphones, my battery bank, my tablet, or whatever else I might need when I'm on the go. Now, if I'm caught in the rain, that's okay because Bellroy's products are also water resistant, so they keep your valuables protected long term. But the best part about Bellroy isn't just their products. It's how they make them. All the main body fabrics and linings used are 100% from recycled materials. Furthermore, Bellroy are sourcing Blue Sign certified textiles, meaning that the materials in Bellroy's products don't release harmful chemicals. So you can get 10% off any Bellroy product by using my link in the description below. Thanks to Bellroy for sponsoring this video, but now back to our story. By the 1950s, the mail rail was still operating at full capacity, as Britain's post-war economy depended heavily on written communication, and airmail was still in the phase of expanding, in fact. By the 1950s, mail rail was still operating at full capacity, as Britain's post-war economy depended heavily on written communications. However, the writing was on the wall as airmail was in the phase of expanding rapidly. Though the transition would take time, as in that decade, mail arriving from overseas still had to be processed and redistributed through London, meaning the Underground Railway remained a critical link between sorting offices and the mainline stations. But that would not remain the case forever, as the world was on the cusp of a shift. You see, post-war reconstruction brought significant investment in roads, since automobiles, including cargo trucks, grew larger and far more reliable. And as the new routes and early motorways began reshaping how goods moved around the capital, the post office knew that their underground railway was on borrowed time. What's more, through the 1960s and 70s, the postal network itself began to change. Advances in automation reduced the need for large, labor-intensive sorting offices within the city center, so facilities started moving outward, closer to suburban distribution hubs, airports, and motorway junctions. Even so, throughout this evolution, the mail rail still functioned, but it was increasingly disconnected from where the actual mail needed to go. By the 1980s, this misalignment had become difficult to ignore. Operating an underground railway did make sense back when everything arrived by rail and then had to cross the city, but it made far less sense in a system of decentralized logistics. In other words, the system's original strength, its permanence, had, in a weird way, become its ultimate weakness. The decisive break came in 1995, but not underground, back up on the surface. As Britain's rail network was reconstructed and privatized, long-distance mail services were generally removed from London's mainline passenger terminals, and so the intake trains that once fed the system no longer arrived in places like Paddington or Liverpool Street. This severed the connection to the Underground Railway, and practically speaking, without the greater intake from the surface lines, the Underground was effectively severed. And just like that, the original purpose was lost. Remember, the whole idea was to transfer between main trains and central sorting offices. So without that, it didn't make any sense. Hence, by the early 2000s, a rapid decline ensued. Traffic dropped to just a fraction of the former volume, while operating costs remained prohibitively high, and they were projected to grow. So in 2003, another decision was made. The service would end forevermore. And just like that, on May the 3rd, 2003, the final train terminated its journey. From there, the power source was switched off and the tunnels were sealed. When mail rail shut down, the system was not formally abandoned. Rather, it was mothballed, meaning the entrances and stations tied to active sorting offices were sealed, as those buildings were ultimately closed or sold off, sometimes redeveloped. Though at Mount Pleasant, for example, the main access shafts and the platforms did remain in place beneath the former sorting complex. Though elsewhere, former access points at locations such as Paddington, Liverpool Street, and King Edward Street were closed off internally, as postal operations also moved out of central London. And this was what happened in most cases. The entrances were lost or absorbed into redevelopment projects above ground, basically leaving no visible trace. However, below ground, the tunnels were left intact. Things like the tracks, signal equipment, and junctions were never removed. Rather, they were partly maintained. This was possible because it was still considered critical infrastructure. Royal Mail retained ownership and carried out minimal upkeep to prevent flooding, structural degradation, or unauthorized access. Remember, the city wanted to keep it because in times of war, it could become instrumental again. Though the interesting thing is that the trains, now useless, were also left underground. Most of the rolling stock was parked in sidings and depots where it last operated. And actually, this was a practical choice because the tunnels were purpose-built and inaccessible to standard railroad networks. So removing those trains would have required extensive dismantling. So they just remained there, in place, effectively trapped below the city. Importantly here, the early 2000s were also the first time that the world at large heard about the system. You see, unlike its opening, its closing was rather heavily publicized. Word spread, and by the early 2010s, mail rail began appearing in documentaries, urban exploration features, and transportation history. To be clear, the system did appear earlier in films, most notably in the 1991 movie Hudson Hawk, but those features didn't compare to what the attention of the age of the internet world would bring. And as the hype grew, it became clear that the public at large wanted to see this novelty firsthand. Hence, a short section of the railway beneath Mount Pleasant was actually restored and adapted for tourist access. In 2017, it reopened as part of the Postal Museum using modified passenger cars running through the original tunnels. And for the first time, the public could ride a railway that had spent its entire working life hidden away from view. Though it's important to note that most of the system actually remains closed off and totally forbidden. In closing, it's fair to mention that mail rail did not exist in isolation. This turn-of-the-century experiment with separating mail from street level indeed had a few other notable mentions. Cities like Paris, Berlin, Munich, and New York all tested underground or semi-underground postal delivery systems during the late 19th and 20th centuries. Some relied on pneumatic tubes, others on small electric railways, often tied to a central post office or railway terminal. But London's system was unique in its scale, automation, and longevity. Now that being said, today, underground mail rails are a lost technology. No major city operates a complete underground network like this. Modern logistics have moved in a different direction, towards roads, air, and highly flexible distribution hubs, meaning that the tunnels beneath London are an obsolete monument to how the world changed around them. With that being said, we'll leave it there for today, but I hope you enjoyed the story of London's lost underground mail rail. I know I certainly did. And another special thank you to Bellroyd for sponsoring the episode. I've got to say, I am just loving this gear, and I hope you guys will take the time to support them and check it out. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.